Hey guys, I apologize for the tardiness of me presenting to you guys. I had a really huge family emergency. Wednesday, and these past couple of days, has been nothing but what would a skeptic say? Chaotic consciousness. But I'm here, so let's get started. To warn everyone ahead of time, this is a bit philosophical. Um, So if there's any concept that I discussed that is confusing or something that I said within the PowerPoint that is confusing, you are free to comment under the video. I encourage freely. Um, Even if it's just, oh, what does this term mean? Because again, I know that everyone is not a philosophy major, and I know that everyone um, you know, doesn't know that much about philosophy, given that you're not a major. So you can comment if you have any concerns or any clarifying questions, and I will be honored to answer them. Okay, so Nathaniel Hawthorne. Nathaniel Hawthorne is what I like to call a rock star philosopher, or in the sense of this presentation, a rock star skeptic. He is one of my favorite authors from the canon, and this is one of my favorite novels from the canon. I have read the Blithedale romance at least 15 times. Um, I like Hawthorne because he is very dark and existential. I love it. Anyways, Hawthorne holds the belief that humankind, every one of us, might have good intentions, but we are unable to escape our natural state. We are evil. We are sinful. We are tormented by guilt. We are brought down by pride, and we are intolerant to the extreme. In reading Hawthorne, one gets the sense that the world is out of reach for him. And it is also worth noting here that Hawthorne attaches mysticism into almost everything. And when he does that, he detaches his characters, in this sense, Coverdale, from any sense of reality. This idea that any experiment they set out should be set on suspicion. Now, given my interpretation of the text, I give that Hawthorne experiments, quote unquote experiments, and put Coverdale inside Blithedale Farm. And I guess it's safe to argue here that we should expect for Coverdale to be suspicious about his reality, given that the experiments that Hawthorne was giving his characters was set out to be met with suspicion. And it's also worth noting here that the word suspicion is important because this is what skeptics do, right? They are known for suspicion. So that's, I think, that's like a piece of evidence to prove that Hawthorne was indeed a skeptic, because there are multiple arguments out there that he was a transcendentalist when writing the Blithedale romance and everything, but I'm going to discuss that further in the presentation. Now, there's an important distinction that I think needs to be made with this idea, and that is with Thoreau, and specifically his piece Walden that we read in class. Thoreau places the character, on a higher plane than the community. Going into the woods, Thoreau detaches himself from a society in a far different manner than Hawthorne, with grounds in reality. So that's just something to think about, because I know usually Dr. Ramos sometimes asks us what is different from Thoreau and Hawthorne, or Emerson and Thoreau. So I just thought it would be nice to include that distinction. Okay. As I discussed previously, Hawthorne is a skeptic. There is an argument that when Hawthorne wrote the Blithedale romance, he was a transcendentalist. However, they're wrong. Because Blithedale romance documents Hawthorne's journey to skepticism of the transcendental movement. And I think that's the misconception there, is that they see the Blithedale romance as him reaching skepticism. But he indeed was a skeptic before writing this novel. And another point of proof that Hawthorne is a skeptic is this quote that you see here. And Hawthorne, a year before he wrote the Blithedale romance, stated, "I have not lived, but only dreamed about living." Before he wrote the Blithedale romance, this is what he said: "I have not lived, but only dreamed about living." And I think what is important here is that Hawthorne is referencing Cartesian philosophy. Descartes, those who don't know what Cartesian philosophy is, it's philosophy by Descartes, who is one of my favorite modern philosophers. And this idea of dream versus reality, illusion versus reality, what is real. So just for Hawthorne stating a quote like this shows that he believes in skeptical views. Ergo, we can conclude here that he indeed was a skeptic. Okay. So how does skepticism play a role in Hawthorne's Blithedale romance? Relativity of perception. This idea that we only have knowledge but through dogmatism, and that what that means is that we have knowledge, but it is limited, which is a reason why Coverdale is unreliable, an unreliable narrator. And there's a popular argument out there in literary research that Coverdale is unreliable because his mind is distorted and restricted. Essentially, Coverdale is ignorant, limited of knowledge, thus making him unreliable. It is also worth noting here that skepticism also plays a role in the Blithedale romance because Coverdale's experience of the Blithedale romance, of the Blithedale world rather, seems to be completely replicated in dreams. And note what I said earlier about Cartesian philosophy. In dreams. See that notion of skepticism? But furthermore, there is no certain way to distinguish dreams from waking experience. But the world of a dream seems real, but it is not. I mean, for example here, Coverdale living in Blithedale felt like a dream, a fake reality, a world of illusion. There is a popular argument that the plot is a paramount problem in the Blithedale romance. Kelly Griffith, the English scholar, known as the author to my piece of literary criticism, argues through a philosophical argument why the form of the plot is distorted. Griffith essentially answers this question, why the form of the plot is so distorted. That is what stems her argument. The first central argument here is that the form that Hawthorne creates is entirely dependent on the very restricted point of view of Miles Coverdale. The second central argument that Griffith argues that Hawthorne purposely distorts the narrative in order to indicate Coverdale's state of mind. And lastly, Griffith argues that the plot does not proceed logically simply because Hawthorne did not intend for it to do so. Okay? So, I wanted to share an excerpt from Griffith's article that helps illustrate the notion of dream and reality, this idea of skepticism, the idea of metaphysics, and how the form in which Hawthorne writes indeed not only shows the mental state and the epistemic capacity of Coverdale, but also the different reality he lives and experiences in Blithedale. So, in the first half, the narrative moves logically, except for the veiled lady legend and the sporadic appearances of Old Moody. The reader can accept the events as reasonable enough. The second half, however, is extraordinary for its chaotic ordering of incidents and its refusal to fructify many of the crucial developments of the first half. The reason for this difference between the halves lies in Hawthorne's use of Coverdale's dreams. The first half we can accept, for the most part, as real. The second half we may see, for the most part, as dream, as a mirror of what Coverdale has seen and thought in the first half, and of what he in fact learns after he leaves Blithedale. He presents at least three types of dreams, all of which contains elements of one another, all of which represent the unreal or an imaginative reworking of the real. So, to break this down and really analyze it, right? Hawthorne writes Blithedale romance. First half, it moves logically. The second half, it's distorted, it's confusing to read. What is important here, and I think this is what maybe Hawthorne was doing, is that it started off more logically because given when Coverdale is placed inside Blithedale, he doesn't realize the suspicion isn't as strong until he's further in there and he starts to see and he starts to examine, where he begins to have a critical eye of reality, and he begins to see what is real and what is not. And I think the chaotic ordering is basically an allegory of really him coming into the sense that Blithedale is false reality. It's this illusion. It's just this, after he leaves Blithedale, he sees that Blithedale was indeed this illusionary part of reality. And that's what I think it is. I may be wrong here. I mean, there are many critiques here, but I think that's what it really is. And I think here, there is some connections with the metaphysics of the Peripatetics or Platonists, or if you will, the Platonic philosophy. This idea of what is real, what is unreal, right? The divided line, the allegory of the cave. I'm going to talk a little briefly about that. Not too much for the sake of time, but I'm going to talk briefly about that later on in the presentation, but that's just something to start thinking about if you are familiar with that. So, my argument is that Hawthorne uses the distorted form to emphasize the reality, the illusionary reality of Blithedale. And my first premise of my argument is that Coverdale says that his attitude toward Blithedale was dreamlike and miserable. And I think it's safe to argue here that he was like a prisoner in a world of illusion and images. A false reality, living in a false reality, living on an ontological level of limitation. And those who are familiar with Plato's allegory of the cave, I think here we can maybe make a similarity and an analogy, not analogy, but more so a similarity. And that is that Coverdale here could be arguably the prisoner chained in the allegory of the cave. My second premise to my argument here is that Coverdale constantly changes reality to something else. And I may be wrong here, but I think that being placed in Blithedale, he is trying to escape that reality. So by doing that, he changes the reality. But I think he is ineffective intentionally. I think Hawthorne intentionally makes him ineffective, given the epistemic circumstances of Coverdale and the epistemology of Coverdale and Hawthorne's philosophy of knowledge, Hawthorne's epistemology, and this idea that humans are limited in knowledge. So that's just another thing to point out. My last premise to my argument is that Coverdale explains that at Blithedale, he had lost a sense of the existing state of the world. In a sense, or in more simpler terms, right, he lost the existing state of true reality. Reality outside of Blithedale Farm. And I think, again, it is safe to argue here that he becomes chaotically unconscious and ignorant of true reality after being in Blithedale Farm. He's unfamiliar. He's now darkened. His knowledge is darkened. He's now ignorant of reality. So, my rationale toward Griffith's argument. I agree with Griffith that Hawthorne purposely distorts the novel to indicate Coverdale's mind. However, I feel Hawthorne here, given his description of reality in Blithedale Romance and his skeptical views, is arguing here that living in a society like Blithedale feels like a dream. He is lost from reality in his existence. This idea that the visible world he is in feels like an illusion. That living in Blithedale is like living in a dreamland, outside from the external objective world. And again, back to the peripatetic philosophy of metaphysics, I would argue here that Blithedale Farm could indeed be a minimal representation of the cave in Allegory of the Cave. Inside the cave. And outside the cave, I would argue that that could be the outer reality outside Blithedale. And I don't know, it's so complex, folks. It's so complex. That this idea, like, what was Hawthorne really thinking with Blithedale Romance? And there's so many criticism out there, and I think my criticism here is a bit more philosophical, but I think here that Blithedale is emphasizing here, yes, answering some of those epistemic questions like what is real, what is unreal, what is our epistemic capacity when we are faced with reality, how do we know the reality that we are in is real, how can we overcome that unreal reality given our limitations of knowledge. There's so many different conceptions here that I think Hawthorne is really pointing to, and I may be wrong here, but I think given my interpretation of the text and given some of the literary criticism on here, I think this is indeed maybe what Hawthorne really was gearing towards here. Is that's giving more so individuals, this idea and this guide to seeing reality given our limitations of knowledge. And I guess really to end here is to ask, what do you think? Do you think that Hawthorne here is maybe through his skeptical views and through, this idea of metaphysics is maybe touching on this basis of reality and what is real, what is unreal, and this idea of knowledge and limitations of knowledge and, you know, his epistemology, because Hawthorne's epistemology really talks a lot about the limitations of human knowledge. So, do you think maybe this is maybe him um, fabricating his philosophy here in this piece? Um, and I really wanted to talk about more so this in a philosophical sense because I think this is something that's really not discussed much because it's hard to identify. And I think I went on a stretch here to really argue this because this is really hidden inside the book. Like I'm talking in an emblematic sense. So I hope you guys really enjoyed the presentation. And if you have any questions, literary or philosophical, please feel free to comment under the video or email me directly. Snaith, JAO1 at mail.buffalostate.edu. I really hope this was an excellent learning experience for you, a meaningful rather learning experience for you, and maybe you learning about some philosophy and really maybe gaining a new perspective of this text. But again, I'm for feedback. Criticisms are welcome. But again, it took me, given that I read this 15 times, I knew the context of the book, but never really it took me to take this class to really understand the philosophical. But before I didn't really know the philosophy I know now when I first read it. So it's just interesting to see. And I think Hawthorne would say here that I'm expanding my knowledge. I think he would be a major critic to that. But have a great weekend, and I really hope you guys enjoyed this presentation.